Welcome to A News. I'm Omar Taslim, and you're watching Turkish Diplomacy. On today's episode, A News editor Mustafa Kocakanar will be joining me to discuss the top global issues from this week, including Turkish President Erdoğan's upcoming visit to Italy, the war in Ukraine, and the terror attack in the illegally Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this news report.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is scheduled to visit Italy on Tuesday for high-level talks with Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and to attend a major business forum. The visit will include the 4th Turkiye-Italy Intergovernmental Summit and the Italy-Turkiye Business Forum, both taking place in Rome on the same day. Erdoğan and Meloni will co-chair the summit and deliver opening remarks at the forum, which will focus on strategic sectors such as defense, aviation, infrastructure, and sustainable energy. Meloni had extended a personal invitation to Erdoğan last year in a phone call discussing bilateral ties. Despite differing stances on Israel's war in Gaza, Meloni supporting Israel's right to self-defense and Erdoğan backing the Palestinian cause, both leaders have maintained regular diplomatic contact and share a commitment to regional stability. Economic relations between Turkey and Italy have continued to grow, with trade volume reaching $32 billion in 2024, surpassing the previously set target. Both NATO allies also share common concerns on migration and regional security, functioning as key actors and bridge builders in the Mediterranean.
Welcome back to the program. A News editor Mustafa Kocakanar, a very warm welcome to you as well.
Good morning, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start our discussions today with President Erdoğan's visit to Italy. Now he's scheduled to visit Rome on April 29th. That's next Tuesday. He will be meeting Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and there's a few summits that he's going to attend. Please tell us about this visit.
Omar, as you say, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is slated to pay an official visit to Italy next Tuesday, and he is scheduled to participate in 4th Turkey-Italy Intergovernmental Summit and Italy-Turkey Business Forum. On the sidelines of these two important events, I think Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan is also projected to meet with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. And I think both the Turkish and Italian decision makers will discuss all aspects of bilateral political, economic, military and cultural relationships between Turkey and Italy. On the other hand, I think they will exchange views on the latest geopolitical developments in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean region. As you know, Turkey and Italy have a different stance on Israel's warfare in Gaza. As Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni is supporting Israel's so-called right to defend itself from security threats coming from the Palestinian territories, Turkey is reiterating its strong support for the Palestinian cause. I think they will discuss the ways about what can be done to reach long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East. As you also know, Meloni is also calling for a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian resistance group Hamas. I think Turkey and Italy can increase their bilateral cooperation, dialogue and diplomacy to increase awareness about Israel's ethnic cleansing in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think Erdoğan's upcoming visit to Italy will help both Ankara and Rome strengthen their dialogue and cooperation in terms of addressing regional geopolitical challenges both in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean.
Mustafa, like you said, Meloni has a different stance on the war, the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So how is Erdoğan using his influence? Because we've we've seen ever since the war began that Erdoğan has been using his influence, using his diplomatic channels, his diplomatic measures to influence Western leaders to support Palestine. And yesterday we saw that the Norwegian foreign minister was in Turkey. He was in Ankara. He met with the Turkish foreign minister Hakan Fidan. They also discussed, the state of Palestine, and Norway said that it's ready to recognize this state. So how is Erdoğan going to discuss this situation with Giorgia Meloni? How is Erdoğan going to use this channel to support the rights of Palestinians?
Omar, as we know, Israel has started its military campaign against Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip in October 2023. And since the very beginning of the crisis, Turkish decision makers, especially President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, have been increasing their efforts to increase international awareness about Israel's genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing in the occupied Palestinian territories. Turkey has been always supporting the recognition of the Palestinian state in the region, because Turkey claims that if the international community, Western countries in particular, wants to see long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East, they are supposed to recognize the independence rights of the Palestinian people living in the region. Within this context, Turkey is always calling upon its Western partners within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to recognize the Palestinian state. And I think upcoming visit to Italy, we will see this topic will be on the agenda between Erdoğan and Meloni. I think Erdoğan will call upon Italian Premier Meloni to give her country's support for the legitimate rights of Palestinian people living in the region. As you also said, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan yesterday hosted his Norwegian counterpart. As you know, Norway is one of the important countries recognizing the Palestinian rights in the region. Last year, some Western countries, including Norway and Spain, recognized the independence of Palestinian state. Turkey is always claiming that if the international community recognizes the Palestine as a state, it will also ensure the safety of Israel in the region. Within this context, Turkey, I think, will continue to call for Palestinian state, independent and territorially integrated Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. I think this upcoming visit will show us further diplomatic actions taken by Turkey to increase awareness the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people living in the Middle East.
Mustafa, there's a common problem that both of these countries share, and that's migration. Over the last decade, Turkey has seen its fair share of illegal migrants coming to the country. And then the same situation we saw is present in Italy as well, because migrants from North Africa, from the Mediterranean, are trying their best, especially from Libya, countries in Northern Africa, especially from Libya. They're trying to get into the European Union through Italy. How do you believe that these sides are going to discuss the issue of migration? And Italy has taken a very harsh stance. That is also extremely different from what Turkey does, because Turkey accepts refugees and lets them stay in the country, because Erdoğan has said that we are going to protect the rights of refugees. But when you see the situation in Italy, it's a bit different. Now there's a new policy which sends those migrants to Albania to be processed, and then they can come back to Italy. So how is Italy viewing this entire migration issue?
Omar, the irregular migration issue is one of the most challenging issues in the Eastern Mediterranean. As you know, Turkey is always pursuing open door policy in terms of receiving the migrants from all over the world. As you know, during the civil war years in Syria, Turkey accepted more than 3 million Syrian refugees without questioning their background. And Turkey is always calling for the fair share and burden sharing among countries to host migrants. On the other hand, as you say, Italy is pursuing tough actions against irregular migrants. Within this context, Italy and Albania signed a migration deal, and Italy is deporting migrants to Albania. On the other hand, Turkey is always calling for the international support for its policies to keep migrants in Turkey. I think Erdoğan and Meloni will discuss this one of the most important issues between Turkey and Italy. I think if both the Turkish and Italian decision makers decide to increase their bilateral cooperation in terms of coping with irregular migration issue, I think it will help the region deal with problems facing these countries, and I think it will ensure long-standing peace and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean.
So there's also defense. That's a very important aspect of the bilateral ties between Turkey and Italy. Now, I think it was earlier this year or last year, Baykar, which produces the Bayraktar drones, bought Piaggio Aerospace for $100 million. What does this tell us about Turkey's economic strength? And they are expected to sign new defense contracts as well with Italy. So tell me a bit more about that.
Umar, as you know, economy and defense cooperation are two important pillars defining the bilateral relationship between Turkey and Italy. Within this context, as you know, Baykar is one of the most advanced defense technology companies in Turkey. It's producing world's most advanced unmanned aerial vehicles in the world, and Turkey is exporting its drone capabilities to dozens of countries in the world. And Baykar is also strengthening its cooperation with the Italian defense companies. Within this context, Baykar is taking important steps to strengthen its ties with its Italian counterparts. I think next week maybe we will see the signing of agreements between Turkey and Italy on the defense field. I think it will help both countries strengthen their bilateral cooperation in the defense field. I think the strengthening and enhancing bilateral relationship between Turkey and Italy in terms of defense technology will help Europe defend itself against upcoming threats. As you know, Italy is also mentioning about the Russian threat against the European continent. I think collaboration and cooperation between Turkey and Italy in the defense field will yield positive results in terms of ensuring long-lasting peace, security, and tranquility in the European continent.
Mustafa, one last thing before we move to our second topic of the day. Hakan Fidan hosted the Norwegian foreign minister in Ankara yesterday, and he reiterated his, in fact, the Turkish government's stance on the situation on Cyprus Island. He said, despite some countries having given their official approval, their official presence on the southern side, this issue is very important for Turkey, and Hakan Fidan has said that the Turkic world continues to support Turkish Cypriots. So how are you looking at this situation, and how is it, what sort of actions is the Turkish government willing to take in light of the events that happened with Turkic states?
Omar, in 1974, as we know, Turkish military forces conducted a Cyprus peace operation to save Turkish Cypriots living on the islands from the Greek Cypriots atrocities. And within this context, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus declared its independence at the beginning of the 1980s. And Turkey right now is the only country recognizing the independence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. On the other hand, Turkey is always leading the Turkic world to increase awareness about the legitimate rights of Turkish Cypriots living on the island. Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar is always reiterating his country's support for two-state solution to the Cyprus issue, because he claims that there are right now two separate nations living on the island. He says that one nation is Turkish Cypriots and the other nation is Greek Cypriots. But on the other hand, Greek Cypriots are calling for federalism for the solution to the problem. But federalism didn't work on the island, I think, and it will not work in the future. I think the best solution to the problem will be two-state solution. Turkey and Turkish decision makers are always calling for two-state solution in the region. Within this context, within the organization of Turkic states, Turkey is calling upon the other members to recognize the independence of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. But on the other hand, there was a summit at the beginning of this month in Uzbekistan. It was summit held between Turkic countries in the Central Asia and the European Union. And after that, some Turkic states decided to appoint ambassadors to the Greek Cypriots, and they reportedly recognized the United Nations resolution about the Cyprus issue. Right now, there are many discussions within both Turkey and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And yesterday, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan reiterated Turkey's and Turkic states' strong support for the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. He says that Turkey will not allow any provocations in terms of poisoning the bilateral relationships between Turkey and other Turkic countries. I think in the upcoming future, Turkey and the other Turkic states will find a common way and common sense to deal with bilateral disputes over Cyprus issue. And I think with the help of Azerbaijan, they will improve their diplomacy and dialogue to continue their bilateral or multilateral cooperation in terms of dealing with the common security threats.
Russia is continuing to attack Ukraine. Kyiv was targeted yesterday in major strikes. Let's take a look at this news report about the latest situation and what's happening there.
Rescue workers found a man alive in the rubble in Kyiv after Russia hit the Ukrainian capital overnight. At least 12 people were killed in the missile and drone strikes, and at least 90 were wounded in the biggest attack there this year. Anxious friends and relatives of those missing stood near destroyed buildings hoping for good news. The violence led to a rare rebuke from U.S. President Donald Trump, who told Russian President Vladimir Putin on Truth Social, quote, "Vladimir, stop." Trump was asked about his message to Putin during a meeting with Norway's Prime Minister in the Oval Office.
What is your level of frustration with President Putin?
I didn't like last night. I wasn't happy with it. And we're in the midst of talking peace, and missiles were fired. And I was not happy with it. That's what I meant.
Why are you not putting more pressure on Russia? I know a lot of Europeans.
Putting a lot of pressure. You don't know what pressure I'm putting on Russia. They're dealing. You have no idea what pressure I'm putting on Russia. We're putting a lot of pressure.
Can you maybe tell us that?
We're putting a lot of pressure on Russia, and Russia knows that, and some people that are close to it know, or he wouldn't be talking right now.
What concessions has Russia offered up thus far to get to the point where you're closer to peace?
Stopping the war, stopping taking the whole country. Pretty big concession.
Trump said he still believed both sides wanted to make a deal to end the war begun by Russia in 2022. But the White House has also threatened to abandon its efforts at peace talks if no progress is made soon. On Wednesday, Trump slammed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky over a comment in which Zelensky repeated that Kyiv would not recognize Russia's occupation of Crimea. Zelensky, who cut short his trip to South Africa after the Russian attack, said he did not see signs Washington was putting strong pressure on Russia. Ukraine's foreign minister said on X that the brutal strike showed that Russia, not Ukraine, was the obstacle to peace, a viewpoint shared by EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas during her visit to Moldova.
It is clear that we want peace. Moldovans want peace, Ukrainians want peace, Europeans want peace. But the reality is that Putin is escalating attacks, and it's making it clear that he doesn't want peace. It takes two to want peace. It only takes one to want war. We have to keep supporting Ukraine, that they are able to defend themselves.
Talks did take place between the U.S., Ukrainian, and European officials in London this week, and Zelensky said on Thursday that the meeting with a U.S. representative had not been easy, but that it had been constructive. A U.S. official said Trump's special envoy is expected to meet Putin on Friday for more talks.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa, now let's just discuss the war in Ukraine. President Zelensky was in South Africa, and like we just heard, he cut his trip short to go back to Ukraine after the Russian attacks in Kyiv. Now, he says that he is not seeing the United States put a lot of pressure on Russia in order to reach a ceasefire deal. And as we all know, there are talks that were held in London, and even those talks have not been constructive, and Russia has been continuing to attack Ukrainian cities. What is the latest development, Mustafa, in Ukraine? Can we see a ceasefire soon?
Mar, since Donald Trump took the Oval Office at the White House in January, there have been diplomatic engagements among regional stakeholders and international powers in terms of reaching a ceasefire deal between Russia and Ukraine. But on the other hand, we can see that there is still ongoing war between Ukrainian and Russian military forces. As you know, I think right now both sides are trying to convince the United States and its President Donald Trump to believe that other side is trying to obstruct the peace efforts between two sides. As you know, Ukrainian and Russian officials have been holding separate conversations with their American counterparts in terms of reaching a ceasefire deal. But on the other hand, right now, I think in the United States, there is Ukraine fatigue. Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance and his Secretary of State Marco Rubio are regularly expressing their frustration over both Ukraine and Russia in terms of reaching an ceasefire deal. Within this context, I think in the coming future, we will not be able to see any long-standing ceasefire deal between two warring sides. I think the confrontations will continue on the ground. Both Russia and Ukraine are accusing each other of striking their important military positions. And this week, Russia also targeted Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, leaving dozens of dead in Kyiv. I think these type of military actions will harm and poison the international efforts to reach a long-standing truce deal between Ukraine and Russia.
Mustafa, you're saying that there are frustrations which are growing between all of the three sides that are involved. Russia is calling for concessions. Ukraine is saying that Putin must leave all the territories before we can negotiate a ceasefire deal. Trump is saying that we need action. But over the last few days, we've also heard that Trump has said that the United States could withdraw from these peace talks. Do you believe that the United States at this point could withdraw from these peace talks? Because at the end of the day, we need a ceasefire in place. But what could happen if the United States decides to withdraw from these talks?
The United States is right now threatening to cease its efforts for reaching a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. But if I think Ukraine and Russia want long-standing peace in the Eastern Europe, I think there will be concessions from the both sides. Right now, some American correspondents are claiming that Donald Trump is willing to recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. In 2014, as you know, Russia annexed Crimea. And no one is recognizing the annexation of Crimea from the Western countries right now. As you know, Turkey is also a part of the Black Sea region. Turkey can be described as the facilitator and mediator between Ukraine and Russia in terms of reaching a ceasefire or peace between two warring sides. And Turkey is also reiterating its strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty over Crimea. I think if Donald Trump takes a step in terms of recognizing the annexation of Crimea by Russia, I think it will not yield positive results in terms of reaching a ceasefire deal, because Ukraine is reiterating its strong opposition to the Russia's occupation in Crimea. And I think Ukraine will seek help from other countries in terms of convincing the United States not to recognize the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. Turkey, I think, can play an important role between Kyiv and Moscow right now to hold peace talks, because Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia on different fields. I think if the world and the Western countries wants to bring a long-standing peace and stability to the Eastern Mediterranean, I think they will be supposed to take Turkey's balanced approach and Turkey's legitimate demands on the region into consideration, because Turkey is always reiterating its decision about resolving the bilateral disputes between Ukraine and Russia. I think Turkey's mediation role will help both the warring sides reach a ceasefire agreement and ensure long-standing peace and stability in the Eastern Europe.
So let's take a look at some of the statements released by the Russian Foreign Ministry. It says that Europe is encouraging war by supplying arms. Then it has said that Russia views Crimea as a settled issue since 2014. And Zelensky and Trump have also had a disagreement over Crimea. Tell me, why is Crimea so important? You just mentioned about Turkey's stance on Crimea, but tell me, why is it so important for both sides? And how is Turkey viewing this statement, the disagreements between the United States and Ukraine over Crimea? So why is it so important? And what is Turkey's position on Crimea? It says that it's illegally annexed by Russia.
Mark, Crimea, I think, has both symbolic and geostrategic importance in the region, because the control in Crimea, I think, is allowing the control in the Black Sea region. It represents the geopolitical importance of Crimea in the region. On the other hand, it has symbolic importance for Ukraine. As you know, Soviet Union in 1950s, I think, gave Crimea to Ukraine. And since then, Ukraine had been controlling the Crimea. But as I said during my previous conversation, Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014. Since then, Ukrainian decision makers have been always reiterating their country's determination to take Crimea back from Russian occupation. And right now there are some negotiations between warring sides and international mediators focusing on Crimea. And if United States recognizes the annexation of Crimea by Russia, I think it will also set an example for other countries to annex other parts of the world, and it will put danger the world of stability at risk. I think it will not help both regional and international stakeholders in terms of ensuring international peace and security. Turkey's position here is clear. Turkey is always reiterating its strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity. It will not recognize the annexation of Crimea by Russia, I think, and Turkey will use its diplomatic leverage to increase awareness among Western countries about Crimea. And I think if Turkey takes important steps in terms of hosting Ukraine-Russia peace talks, I think Turkey will bring this issue on the negotiating table, and I think most Western countries will support Turkey's balanced approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflicts. As you know, some Western countries, including Europeans, are eager to exclude Russia from the peace talks, and the United States is right now willing to exclude Ukraine from the peace talks. But Turkey says that if there will be a long-standing peace between Ukraine and Russia, all warring sides should sit at the table and to discuss what can be done in terms of reaching a ceasefire agreement. Turkey is always reiterating that there will be no winners in the war, and there will be no losers in the peace. I think this motto will help both Ukraine and Russia reach a ceasefire or truce deal.
Talking about occupation and annexation, tensions are rising between Pakistan and India after a terror attack in the Indian-occupied Kashmir. Let's find out more.
I say to the whole world,
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowed on Thursday to hunt down those behind the deadly attack in Kashmir.
we will pursue them to the ends of the earth. India's spirit will never be broken by terrorism.
Gunmen shot and killed 26 men at a tourist destination in the region, and police have identified 2 of the perpetrators as Pakistani. It marked the worst attack on civilians in the country in nearly 2 decades. Modi's comments are bound to further inflame relations between the 2 nuclear-armed countries.
Recognizing
Diplomacy was already weak before India downgraded ties with Pakistan late on Wednesday, closing the only land border crossing between the neighbours and suspending a 6-decade-old water treaty, which Pakistan's energy minister has branded as a, quote, cowardly, illegal move. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, thousands protested outside the Pakistan embassy, demanding action over the attack, while victims' families gathered to pay their respects to their loved ones. Hindu-majority India and Muslim Pakistan control separate parts of Kashmir, and both claim it in full. Modi has called for a meeting to brief all parties on the government's response to the attack. And in Pakistan, the foreign minister said the government was set to hold a meeting about their country's response.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa, this deadly attack in Kashmir has claimed the lives of 26 tourists. Obviously, whenever there is an attack like this, we should not be blaming a particular party, a particular government, or a particular organization. Now, India has blamed Pakistan for supporting these terrorists. A group named Kashmir Resistance actually claimed responsibility. Now, someone would ask, why is Pakistan involved in these attacks? Actually, Pakistan might not be involved because this is and another resistance movement, just like the Palestinians in Gaza. Let me tell you a few details about what has been happening in Kashmir. In 2019, the Modi government had revoked Kashmir's semi-autonomous status, and people have been fighting in that region for their rights, for their civil liberties, for their freedoms. And now this attack has again raised tensions between Pakistan and India. Diplomats have been called back home from both sides. Pakistani nationals who were living in India, they have been called back. Indian nationals who were living in Pakistan, they've been asked to leave the country. Now, how are you looking at these latest developments, considering that India has been an occupying force in Kashmir, and now Pakistan's National Security Council has convened? They have said that this amounts to war, and India has also threatened to cut the Indus River's water supply. How are you looking at these developments, Mustafa?
Umar, Kashmir has been always one of the important topics between India and Pakistan, and recent attack in the Indian-ruled Kashmir region have resulted the death of dozens of people. And following this deadly attack, Indians started to blame Pakistan for increasing tensions in the region. But on the other hand, Pakistan has strongly denied any involvement in this type of attacks in Kashmir region. I think both sides should prioritize dialogue and diplomacy to de-escalate the situation in the region. But right now, both sides are escalating tensions in the region. As you know, India is taking some important steps to put Pakistan on the different position. Indian media and some politicians are calling for military action against Pakistan. On the other hand, Pakistan halted its trade relationships with India. It is also taking its own steps to encounter Indian threats and Indian security threats. Within this context, I think some important players can play an important role to de-escalate the situation between Pakistan and India. But on the other hand, these are the countries and they have nuclear weapons. In the international relations, there are important theories in terms of nuclear deterrence. I think nukes will change everything between India and Pakistan. I think they will reach a common sense in terms of not escalating geopolitical tensions. I think nukes will help both India and Pakistan de-escalate the geopolitical situation, and Turkey can play an important role in terms of reaching common sense between both Indians and Pakistanis.
Mustafa, the Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif was in Ankara this week. He discussed the Cyprus issue, the Gaza issue, and the issue of Kashmir. So just very briefly, how is Turkey viewing the current developments in the occupied Kashmir region?
Umar, as you said, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan this week welcomed Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif in the capital Ankara on Wednesday and on Tuesday. They discussed all aspects of bilateral relationship between Turkey and Pakistan, also exchanging views on the latest developments in the occupied Kashmir region. Turkey is always supporting Pakistan's legitimate stance on the Kashmir issue with India. But on the other hand, Turkey is also enjoying close relationships with India. Within this context, I can say that Turkey can play a facilitator or mediator role between India and Pakistan to resolve their bilateral disputes over Kashmir issue. Turkey is always calling for diplomacy and dialogue between India and Pakistan to deal with their bilateral disputes. I think both Pakistan and India will be eager to take Turkey's balanced approach to the problem into the consideration, and I can easily say that Turkey's position over the Kashmir issue will help both India and Pakistan cope with their bilateral disputes. Within this context, maybe Erdoğan will engage phone conversation, or Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan will engage phone conversation with his Pakistani and Indian counterparts to find a way, common way to de-escalate the geopolitical tensions in the region. I think Turkey will take important steps in the coming future to resolve the bilateral disputes between India and Pakistan.
Hey, News Editor Mustafa Kocakanar, thank you for being on the program. As usual, we discuss some of the most important topics: Turkey, Kashmir, Russia, Ukraine, Trump. Thank you once again for being on the program.
Thanks for hosting, Omar.
To conclude today's episode, we've covered key global issues impacting Turkey, including President Erdoğan's upcoming visit to Italy, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the recent attack in Jammu and Kashmir. Stay tuned for more in-depth discussions and expert insights in future episodes of Turkey's Diplomacy.